The great hall of Ashford Manor had never felt so cold. Alara stood in the center of the marble floor, her pale hands folded in front of her, while 300 pairs of eyes watched her husband speak the words that would end her marriage. Duke Cassian Ashford did not look at her as he spoke. He looked past her, toward the tall windows, as if the sight of her face had become something he could no longer bear. "I, Cassian Ashford, Duke of Ashford, hereby set aside my wife, Alara Ashford, for her failure to provide this house with an heir." The words echoed off the stone walls. A gasp rippled through the crowd of nobles who had gathered for what they believed was simply another evening banquet. No one had expected this. No one except the Dowager Duchess, who stood beside her son with a look of quiet satisfaction, and Lady Priscilla, who watched from the edge of the room with a small, careful smile. Alara did not cry. She had promised herself weeks ago that she would not give any of them the satisfaction of her tears. She kept her spine straight and her chin level, even as the weight of every stare pressed down on her like stones. 3 years, Cassian continued, his voice hard and final. 3 years of marriage, and you have given this family nothing. My mother is right. My name deserves a woman who can carry on my bloodline. A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone near the back whispered the word Baron, and the whisper spread like fire through dry grass. Alara felt each syllable land on her skin like a small, cold blade, but she did not flinch. She wanted to speak. She wanted to tell him the truth, the secret she had guarded so carefully for 9 long months, hidden beneath loose gowns and long shawls and careful excuses about her failing health. But the moment was not right. It might never be right, not standing here in front of a room full of people who had already decided who she was. Cassian finally turned to look at her, and for one brief second something flickered behind his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or maybe only impatience. She could not tell anymore. 3 years ago she had thought she understood this man. Now he was a stranger wearing a familiar face. "You will leave the estate within the week," he said. "You may take your personal belongings, nothing more." Lady Priscilla stepped forward then, gliding across the floor in a gown of deep blue silk, her golden hair catching the candlelight. She placed a hand gently on Cassian's arm, and the gesture was not lost on anyone in the room. It was a declaration, quiet but unmistakable. The next Duchess of Ashford had already claimed her place. "My lord," Priscilla said softly, her voice carrying just enough for the nearest guests to hear, "you have made a difficult but necessary choice. A house needs an heir. Everyone here understands that." A few heads nodded. Alara watched the Dowager Duchess press her lips into a thin line of approval, and something inside Alara's chest twisted painfully. She had spent 3 years trying to earn that woman's respect, cooking her favorite meals when the kitchen staff fell ill, sitting with her through long winter evenings, listening to stories about a son who had once been kind. None of it had mattered in the end. "Is there nothing you wish to say?" Cassian asked, and for a moment Alara thought she heard something almost like hope in his voice, as if he wanted her to fight, as if some small part of him wanted a reason to change his mind. But pride held her tongue. If he could stand here, in front of everyone who had ever known her, and call her a failure without once asking why she had been so ill these past months, without once wondering what she might have been protecting, then he did not deserve the truth. Not yet. Not like this. "No, my lord," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I have nothing to say." The words seemed to surprise him. His jaw tightened, and for a heartbeat, the mask of certainty on his face cracked just slightly. But then Lady Priscilla whispered something in his ear, and whatever softness had appeared in his expression vanished as quickly as it came. "Then this matter is settled," Cassian announced to the room. "The marriage is ended. Lady Alara will vacate the eastern wing by week's end." The crowd began to murmur again, this time with the low buzz of gossip that would surely spread across the countryside by morning. Alara turned without another word and walked from the hall, her steps measured and slow, refusing to let anyone see her hurry away in shame. Her maid, a young woman named Nettie, met her in the corridor outside, eyes wide with worry. Nettie had been the only servant to remain loyal through the whispers and the cold treatment from the other staff, the only one who knew the true reason behind Alara's frequent illness and her retreats to the guest cottage on the far edge of the estate grounds. "My lady," Nettie whispered, taking Alara's arm gently, "are you unwell? You should not be standing so long." "I am fine," Alara said, though her voice trembled slightly on the last word. She placed a hand against the small of her back, where a dull ache had been building for hours, an ache she had been trying to ignore since that afternoon. They walked together through the quiet halls of the manor, away from the noise and the candlelight and the cruel words still echoing behind them. Alara's mind raced with everything she had held inside for so long: the secret pregnancy, the fear of losing another child, as she nearly had 2 years before, when a fall down the stone steps had ended her first hope of motherhood in blood and heartbreak, the careful lies she had told the physicians who came to examine her supposed illness. The long, lonely nights spent alone in the guest cottage, away from prying eyes, waiting for a moment when it would finally be safe to tell the truth. She had planned to wait until the child was born safely, until she could be certain the small life inside her would survive, before revealing anything to Cashin. She had not trusted him with the fragile hope she carried, not after watching him grow colder and more distant with each passing month, not after hearing him speak with his mother about finding a new wife who could give him what he wanted. Now that plan had unraveled in the worst possible way. She had been cast aside before she ever had the chance to speak. As they reached the narrow servants' staircase that led toward the eastern wing, another sharp pain gripped Alara's abdomen, stronger than before. She stopped walking, one hand pressed against the stone wall to steady herself, her breath catching sharply. "My lady," Nettie's voice rose with alarm. Alara closed her eyes, waiting for the pain to pass, but it did not fade the way it usually did. Instead, it built, wave after wave, tightening across her back and abdomen in a rhythm she recognized with sudden, terrifying clarity. "Nettie," she breathed, gripping the maid's arm tightly. "Send for the physician, quietly. No one else must know." Nettie's face went pale, but she nodded quickly, understanding without needing further explanation. She had suspected for months, had helped Alara hide the growing evidence beneath careful layers of fabric, had brought food and medicine to the cottage under cover of darkness. Now the moment they had both feared and prepared for had arrived, on the very night everything else had fallen apart. "The cottage," Alara said through gritted teeth as another wave of pain rolled through her. "Take me there, now." They moved as quickly as Alara's condition allowed, slipping through the shadowed halls and out a side door that led toward the gardens, avoiding the main pathways where guests still lingered, laughing and gossiping about the dramatic scene they had just witnessed. The cool night air struck Alara's face as they stepped outside, and for a moment, the shock of it helped clear her mind, sharpening her focus on the single most important thing left in her world. Behind them, inside the manor, the celebration of her downfall continued. Ahead of them, in the small cottage at the edge of the estate, her entire future waited to be born. Alara did not look back at the manor as they walked. She kept her eyes fixed forward, on the small light glowing in the cottage window, where Nettie's younger sister had already begun preparing linens and warm water, unaware of exactly how soon they would be needed. The pain came again, harder this time, and Alara gasped, doubling over slightly as Nettie held her steady. "We are almost there, my lady," Nettie said, her voice trembling but determined. "Just a little further." Alara nodded, unable to speak through the tightening grip of another contraction. Somewhere behind her, faintly, she could still hear the distant sound of music drifting from the great hall, a cruel reminder of everything she had lost that night. But ahead of her in the darkness, something new was beginning. Something that no one inside that hall could have imagined. Something that would change everything, and soon, everyone at Ashford Manor would know the truth she had carried in silence for so long. The cottage door came into view, warm light spilling from its windows into the night. Alara pushed forward, one hand pressed against her abdomen, the other gripping Nettie's arm for support, her heart pounding with fear and something else, something fierce and unbreakable that she had not expected to feel on the very night her marriage had ended. Hope. Whatever happened next, whatever the future held for her and the child she was about to bring into the world, she would face it. Not as a discarded wife, not as a woman defined by another person's cruel judgment. As a mother. The door opened before them, and Alara stepped through it, leaving behind the cold marble halls of Ashford Manor, and everything she had once believed about the life she was meant to live. Inside the cottage, the warmth of the fire did little to ease the fear gripping Alara's heart. Nettie's younger sister, Fenna, rushed forward the moment the door opened, her arms already full of clean linens, her eyes widening at the sight of Alara's pale face twisted in pain. "It is time," Nettie said quickly, guiding Alara toward the small bed in the back room. "Fenna, fetch the physician, use the back path, no one must see you." Fenna nodded and disappeared into the night without another word, her feet light and quick on the packed earth outside. Alara sank onto the bed, gripping the edge of the wooden frame as another contraction rolled through her body, stronger than the last. For 9 months, she had carried this secret alone, hidden behind long shawls and careful lies about a lingering illness that kept her confined to her chambers for days at a time. It had started as caution, a fear born from the memory of the child she had lost 2 years before, a fall down a flight of stone steps that had nearly taken her own life, along with the small life she had barely begun to know. The physicians at the time had told her, gently but firmly, that she might never carry a child safely to term again. Her body was weak. Her heart, they said, could not withstand the strain. She had believed them, until the day she realized she was carrying again. The joy she had felt in that moment had been fierce and immediate, but it had been followed just as quickly by terror. If Cashin knew, if his mother knew, the entire household would treat her like glass, watching her every movement, questioning her every meal, filling her days with the same suffocating worry that had followed her after the first loss. Worse, if something went wrong again, if she lost this child too, she would have to endure that grief in front of everyone, publicly, with no privacy left to grieve in peace. So she had made a choice. She would carry the secret alone, with only Nettie and a trusted physician from a neighboring town to help her, a woman skilled in medicine but with no ties to the Ashford household or its endless gossip. She would protect this fragile hope until it was strong enough to survive on its own. She had not expected Cashin to grow so cold in the meantime. She had not expected his mother to press him so relentlessly toward finding a new wife. She had not expected Lady Priscilla to appear at every gathering, every dinner, every quiet moment, filling the space Alara's supposed illness had left behind. And she certainly had not expected to give birth on the very night her marriage ended. Another wave of pain crashed through her, sharper than before, and Alara cried out despite her best efforts to stay quiet. Nettie held her hand tightly, whispering words of comfort that barely registered through the haze of pain and fear clouding Alara's mind. "Where is the physician?" Alara gasped between breaths. "Nettie, where is she?" "She will come, my lady. Fenna will find her. Just breathe. You are strong. You have carried this child through everything. You can do this." Alara nodded, though tears had begun to slip down her cheeks despite her earlier vow not to cry. These were different tears, not born of humiliation or heartbreak, but of pain and fear and something else, something she had not allowed herself to feel fully until this moment. Love. Fierce, protective love for the small life, fighting to enter the world at the worst possible time. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The fire crackled in the next room, casting flickering shadows across the ceiling as Alara's contractions grew closer together, more intense, until finally the front door burst open and the physician rushed in, her medical bag already open in her hands. Her name was Marjorie, a woman in her middle years with steady hands and a calm voice that had guided countless children safely into the world. She had attended Alara throughout the pregnancy, traveling quietly to the estate under the guise of tending to sick tenant farmers, always careful never to be seen entering the main house. "How long has she been in labor?" Marjorie asked Nettie, already washing her hands in the basin of warm water Fenna had prepared. "The pain started just after the announcement," Nettie said. "Perhaps 2 hours now." Marjorie nodded and moved to Alara's side, her expression softening with reassurance. "You have done everything right, my lady. Your body is ready. Now we simply need to help this little one find their way into the world." The next hours blurred together in Alara's memory, a haze of pain and effort and Marjorie's steady voice guiding her through each contraction. Nettie stayed beside her the entire time, holding her hand, wiping the sweat from her brow, offering sips of water between the waves of pain that seemed to grow endless. Outside, the celebration at the manor continued, though Alara had long since stopped hearing the distant music. Her entire world had narrowed to the small room, the fire's warm glow, and the fierce determination to bring her child safely into the world. Just past midnight, as a light rain began to patter softly against the cottage windows, Alara felt a shift, a final surge of effort that seemed to gather every remaining ounce of her strength. "One more push, my lady," Marjorie said. "You are almost there, I can see the head." Alara gathered herself, gripping Nettie's hand so tightly the maid winced, and pushed with everything she had left. A moment later, the room filled with the sound of a newborn's cry, sharp and strong and beautiful, cutting through the quiet night like a promise fulfilled. "It is a boy," Marjorie said, her voice thick with emotion as she carefully lifted the small, squirming infant. "A healthy, strong boy." Alara collapsed back against the pillows, exhaustion washing over her in waves, but her eyes never left the small bundle in Marjorie's arms. Moments later, the baby was placed gently against her chest, wrapped in soft linen, his tiny face scrunched up as he continued to cry. "Hello," Alara whispered, tears streaming freely down her face now, tears of joy this time, unguarded and complete. "Hello, my darling boy." The infant quieted almost immediately at the sound of her voice, as if he recognized it from the long months he had spent listening to her heartbeat from within. Alara stared down at him in wonder, taking in every detail of his tiny face, the small tuft of dark hair on his head, the same shade as his father's, the delicate curve of his nose that already seemed to echo her own. Nettie wept openly beside the bed, overwhelmed with relief that both mother and child had survived the ordeal safely. Marjorie moved about the room efficiently, tending to the practical matters of the birth while giving the new mother a few precious moments to simply hold her son and breathe. "He is perfect," Alara murmured, brushing a gentle finger against the baby's soft cheek. "After everything, he is perfect." The irony of the night was not lost on her, even in her exhaustion. Hours before, she had stood in the great hall while her husband declared her unworthy of the Ashford name, unable to give him the heir he demanded. Now, in this quiet cottage far from the manor's cold marble halls, she held that very heir in her arms, born on the same night she had been cast aside. She thought of Cassian, somewhere back at the manor, likely still surrounded by well-wishers congratulating him on his difficult but necessary decision. She wondered if he had any idea what he had truly given up. She wondered how long it would take for the truth to reach him, and what he would do when it did. But for now, in this small room lit only by firelight and the soft glow of dawn beginning to creep through the windows, none of that mattered. What mattered was the small, warm weight in her arms, the tiny fingers curling instinctively around her own, the soft sound of his breathing as he finally drifted into peaceful sleep. "What will you name him, my lady?" Nettie asked softly, settling into a chair beside the bed. Alara considered the question for a long moment, watching her son's peaceful face in the firelight. She thought of her own father, a kind and steady man who had passed away when she was young, a man who had always told her that true strength was found not in power or position, but in quiet resilience. "Elian," she said finally. "His name will be Elian." Nettie smiled through her tears. "A beautiful name, my lady, a strong name." Marjorie finished her final checks on mother and child, pronouncing them both healthy despite the exhausting ordeal, and gave strict instructions for rest and recovery over the coming days. She promised to return the following afternoon to check on them again, and slipped quietly out into the gray light of early morning, leaving Nettie to keep watch over the small household. Alara did not sleep for a long while after Marjorie left, too consumed with wonder and exhaustion and the overwhelming rush of emotions from the night's events. She held Elian close, memorizing every small movement, every soft sound he made, letting herself finally feel the full weight of everything she had carried alone for so many months. She thought about what would happen next. She knew the secret could not remain hidden for long. Word would spread, as it always did in a household full of servants and watchful eyes. Someone would notice her absence from the manor, would wonder about the sudden appearance of a newborn child in the guest cottage, would begin asking questions that would eventually reach the ears of the Dowager Duchess, and through her, Cassian himself. She was not ready to face him yet, not after everything he had said in front of the entire court. Not after the humiliation of being cast aside without so much as a private conversation, without him ever once asking why she had grown so ill, why she had retreated so often to this very cottage over the past months. But she also knew that the truth could not stay buried forever, not with a living, breathing heir now sleeping peacefully in her arms. Whatever came next, whatever storm was brewing back at the manor as the celebrations wound down and the guests began to disperse, she would face it when it arrived. For now, she allowed herself this one quiet moment of peace, watching the first light of dawn spread golden across the cottage floor, her son's small breath steady and even against her chest, the promise of a new beginning wrapped gently in her arms. Outside, somewhere across the estate grounds, the manor slowly stirred to life as servants began their morning duties, unaware that everything was about to change. Word would begin to spread within hours. By midday, whispers would reach every corner of Ashford Manor, whispers that would eventually find their way to the one person who least expected them. Alara closed her eyes at last, allowing herself a brief moment of rest as Nettie kept careful watch beside her, the fire slowly dying down to soft embers, the cottage wrapped in a fragile, temporary peace before the storm that was surely coming. By the time the sun had fully risen over Ashford Manor, the first whispers had already begun to spread. It started in the kitchens, where a young stable hand named Colin mentioned to the cook that he had seen Fenna running toward the northern road well past midnight, her face pale with urgency. The cook, a stout woman named Hetty who had worked in the manor for over 20 years, thought little of it at first, but the details stuck in her mind through the morning as she prepared breakfast for the remaining guests. It was not until one of the upstairs maids mentioned that Lady Alara's chambers had not been touched since the previous evening, the bed still perfectly made, that the pieces began to form a picture too curious to ignore. "She never returned after the announcement," the maid said, wringing her hands nervously. "I thought perhaps she had gone to the eastern guest rooms, but those are empty as well." Hetty frowned, setting down the tray of bread she had been carrying. She had known Alara since the young Duchess first arrived at Ashford Manor 3 years ago, a quiet, gentle woman who had always shown kindness to the staff, even when the Dowager Duchess treated them with cold indifference. Hetty had never quite believed the rumors that had circulated about Alara's supposed inability to bear children. Something about the whispered gossip had never sat right with her. "Someone should check the cottage," Hetty said finally. "The guest cottage by the eastern gardens. I have seen the young lady's maid carrying supplies there for months now, always late in the evening, always in secret." The maid's eyes widened. "You think Lady Alara has been staying there?" "I think," Hetty said slowly, "that there are things happening in this house that none of us have been told about." Word traveled quickly after that. By mid-morning, several of the household staff had gathered near the kitchen entrance, trading theories and half-remembered observations from the past several months. Someone recalled seeing Marjorie, the physician from the neighboring town, arriving at odd hours over recent weeks. Another remembered the strange bundles of linen that had been quietly delivered to the cottage, far more than would be needed for a single occupant. The Dowager Duchess, a sharp and observant woman named Rosalind, caught wind of the growing gossip during her morning tea. She had never fully trusted the ease with which her son had agreed to set Alara aside, though she had pushed for it herself out of desperation for an heir. Something about the timing, the sudden urgency, the way Alara had accepted her fate without a single word of protest, had nagged at her since the previous evening. Now, hearing the servants' whispered speculation about the cottage, a cold suspicion began to form in her mind. "Fetch my carriage," Rosalind said to her personal attendant, rising quickly from her chair. "I wish to see the eastern cottage myself." The attendant hesitated. "My lady, should we not inform the Duke first?" "Not yet," Rosalind said firmly. "I want to know the truth before my son hears anything that might color his judgment further." The carriage ride to the cottage took only a few minutes, but for Rosalind, each moment felt stretched with growing unease. She had raised Cashin to be a fair and thoughtful man, had watched him grow from a curious boy into a dutiful heir, and yet these past months she had barely recognized the coldness that had settled over him. She had told herself it was simply the pressure of his responsibilities, the weight of ensuring the Ashford line continued. Now, as the carriage rolled to a stop outside the small cottage, she wondered if she had been the one steering him toward a mistake neither of them could take back. Nettie answered the door, her face immediately draining of color at the sight of the Dowager Duchess standing on the doorstep. "Your Grace," Nettie stammered, "I did not expect—" "Where is Lady Alara?" Rosalind interrupted, her sharp eyes already scanning the small entryway behind the maid. Before Nettie could answer, the soft, unmistakable sound of a newborn's cry drifted from the back room. Rosalind's breath caught in her throat. She pushed past Nettie without waiting for permission, moving quickly through the cottage until she reached the small bedroom, where Alara sat propped against the pillows, a tiny infant cradled gently in her arms. The two women stared at each other in stunned silence for a long moment. "You," Rosalind whispered, her hand rising to cover her mouth. "You were with child this entire time." Alara's expression hardened, exhaustion and old hurt mixing together in her tired eyes. "Yes, Your Grace, I was." "Why?" Rosalind demanded, though her voice had lost its earlier sharpness, replaced now with something closer to disbelief. "Why did you hide this from us? From Cashin, he would never have." "Would he not?" Alara's voice trembled, but she held the Dowager Duchess's gaze steadily. "I lost a child 2 years ago, Your Grace. I nearly died myself. The physicians told me my body might never carry safely again. I could not bear to face this family's judgment a second time, watching everyone wait and wonder if I would fail again. I could not bear to lose another child in front of an audience of people who had already decided I was worthless." Rosalind's face flickered with something like shame, though she quickly composed herself. "And now?" Alara looked down at the sleeping infant in her arms, and something fierce and protective settled over her features. "Now I have a healthy son, born the very night your son cast me aside as unworthy. His name is Elian." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy. Rosalind stared at the child, taking in the small tuft of dark hair, the delicate features that already bore an unmistakable resemblance to the Ashford line. There was no denying the truth staring back at her. "This changes everything," Rosalind said finally, her voice quieter now, almost unsteady. "Cashin must be told immediately." "Must he?" Alara's chin lifted slightly, old pride resurfacing despite her exhaustion. "He made his choice last night in front of the entire court. He did not ask me a single question before condemning me. Why should I rush to correct his mistake now?" "Because that child is the Ashford heir," Rosalind said. "Whether you wish to reconcile with my son or not, that boy's future is tied to this family. He deserves to be acknowledged, protected, and given his rightful place." Alara said nothing for a long moment, her gaze drifting back down to Elian's peaceful, sleeping face. She knew Rosalind spoke the truth, however unwelcome it was. Her anger toward Cashin did not change the reality of her son's birthright, nor the dangers that might come from keeping his existence hidden any longer. "Tell him then," Alara said quietly. "But know this, Your Grace. Whatever happens next, I will not simply return to being the quiet, dismissed wife I once was. If your son wishes to be part of his son's life, he will need to earn that place. It will not be given freely, not after what he did last night. Rosalind studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind her sharp eyes. That seems more than fair, given the circumstances. She turned to leave, pausing briefly at the doorway. For what it is worth, Lady Alara, I am sorry. I pushed for this outcome as much as anyone. I did not know what you were carrying, what you had already endured. That does not excuse my part in this, but I wanted you to know it. Alara did not respond, too exhausted and too wary of the woman's sudden change of heart to offer forgiveness so easily. Rosalind nodded once, understanding the silence for what it was, and left the cottage to return to the manor. The carriage ride back felt longer than the journey out. Rosalind's mind raced through the implications of what she had just witnessed, the weight of the truth pressing heavily on her conscience. She had spent months pushing her son toward this decision, convinced that Alara's illness was a sign of weakness unfit for the Ashford bloodline. She had never once considered that the illness might have been something else entirely. A mother's desperate attempt to protect a fragile, hard-won pregnancy from a household too eager to judge and too quick to discard. When she arrived back at the manor, she found Cashin in his study, still dressed in the formal attire from the previous evening's announcement, staring blankly at a stack of unread correspondence on his desk. Lady Priscilla sat nearby, pouring tea with the easy confidence of a woman already settling into her expected new role. "Mother," Cashin said, looking up as Rosalind entered, "I did not expect to see you so early." Rosalind glanced briefly at Priscilla before fixing her gaze firmly on her son. "Cashin, I need to speak with you." "Alone?" Priscilla's smile faltered slightly, but she rose gracefully, setting down the teapot. "Of course, I shall leave you to your family matters." Once the door closed behind her, Rosalind crossed the room and sat heavily in the chair across from her son's desk, suddenly feeling every one of her 53 years pressing down on her shoulders. "Cashin," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "there is something you need to know about Alara, something that will change everything you believe about the choice you made last night." Cashin's brow furrowed with confusion, a flicker of unease crossing his features. "Mother, what is this about?" Rosalind drew a steadying breath, preparing to shatter the certainty her son had carried into last night's cruel announcement, certainty that was about to collapse entirely beneath the weight of a truth neither of them had been prepared to face. "Alara gave birth last night," she said finally, "to your son." The color drained from Cashin's face as the words settled over him, and for a long moment he simply stared at his mother in stunned, disbelieving silence, the study around him suddenly feeling far too small to contain the magnitude of what he had just heard. Cashin did not move for a long moment, his mind refusing to accept the words his mother had just spoken. "That is not possible," he said finally, his voice hollow. "Alara has been ill for months. The physicians confirmed it themselves. If she were carrying a child, I would have known. Someone would have told me." "Would you have believed them?" Rosalind asked quietly. "If they had, you had already made up your mind, Cashin. You had already decided she was unfit for this family, long before last night's announcement. What reason would anyone have had to bring you information you refused to hear?" Cashin rose from his desk abruptly, pacing toward the window, his thoughts spinning in chaotic circles. He thought back over the past months, searching for signs he might have missed. Alara's frequent absences, her pale complexion, the loose gowns she had taken to wearing, which he had dismissed as simply another symptom of her supposed illness. The way she had grown quieter, more withdrawn, retreating further into herself with each passing week. He had never once asked her directly what was wrong. He had relied instead on the physician's vague diagnoses and his mother's growing impatience, allowing both to shape his understanding of a woman he had once claimed to love. "Show me," he said abruptly, turning back to face his mother. "I need to see for myself." Rosalind nodded, understanding the desperate need for certainty in her son's eyes. "The cottage by the eastern gardens. But Cashin, listen to me carefully before you go. Whatever you find there, whatever truth awaits you, tread carefully. Alara has been through more than either of us understood. She will not welcome you with open arms, and rightfully so. Cashin barely heard the warning, already moving toward the door, his heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and something else, something he had not allowed himself to feel in months. Fear. Fear that his mother's words were true, fear of what that truth would mean. He rode alone to the cottage, refusing his mother's offer to accompany him, needing the solitude of the short journey to gather his scattered thoughts. The morning air was crisp and cold against his face as he urged his horse faster, the manor's familiar grounds blurring past him in a haze of confusion and dawning dread. When he arrived, he found Nettie standing guard at the door, her expression hardening the moment she recognized him. "Your Grace," she said stiffly, "Lady Alara is resting. She is not prepared to receive visitors." "I need to see her," Cashin said, his voice rough with urgency. "Please, Nettie, I need to know the truth." Nettie studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing her loyalty to her mistress against the reality that this confrontation was likely unavoidable. Finally, she stepped aside, though her eyes remained wary. "Be gentle," she warned. "She has endured enough." Cashin nodded, though he barely registered the words, his focus already narrowing on the small bedroom at the back of the cottage. He pushed the door open slowly, and the sight that greeted him stole the breath from his lungs entirely. Alara sat propped against the pillows, pale and exhausted but undeniably alive, a small bundle cradled gently in her arms. As he stepped closer, he caught his first glimpse of the infant's face, and any lingering doubt he had carried on the ride over evaporated instantly. The child bore an unmistakable resemblance to the Ashford family, the same dark hair, the same shape of the eyes that Cashin recognized from portraits of his own father hanging in the manor's long gallery. There was no question. This was his son. "Alara," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. She looked up at him, her expression guarded and distant, none of the warmth she had once shown him remaining in her tired eyes. "You should not be here, Cashin." "I had to see," he said, moving closer despite the clear tension radiating from her posture. "I had to know if it was true." "And now you know," she said flatly. "Is that enough for you? Have you seen what you came to see?" The bitterness in her voice struck him harder than he expected. He had imagined, somewhere in the frantic ride over, that seeing the truth for himself might allow for some immediate reconciliation, some swift correction of the terrible mistake he had made. But the coldness in her eyes told him clearly that nothing would be so simple. "Alara, I did not know," he said, his voice pleading now. "If I had known you were carrying our child, I never would have." "You never asked," she interrupted sharply, her exhaustion giving way to a flash of anger she had been suppressing for months. 3 years of marriage, Cashin, and you never once asked me directly what was wrong. You listened to physicians who barely examined me properly. You listened to your mother's impatience. You listened to Lady Priscilla's whispered encouragement, but you never once came to me and asked what I was truly suffering through." Cashin flinched at the accuracy of her words, unable to offer any defense against the truth of them. He had been so consumed by pressure and expectation, so eager to secure the family's future, that he had failed to see the woman standing directly in front of him, suffering in silence to protect something she feared she might lose. "I am sorry," he said quietly, the words feeling woefully inadequate against the weight of everything he had done. "I know that means little now, but I am truly sorry, Alara." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but finding only genuine, aching regret staring back at her. Still, the wound he had inflicted was too fresh, too deep to be healed by a simple apology offered hours after the fact. "Sorry does not undo what happened last night," she said. "Sorry does not erase the humiliation I felt standing in that hall while you declared me worthless in front of the entire court. Sorry does not change the fact that I gave birth to your son alone, in a small cottage, without a single member of your family present, on the very night you cast me aside." Cashin lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes any longer. "What would you have me do? Tell me, and I will do it. I will make this right, however long it takes." Alara looked down at the sleeping infant in her arms, her expression softening slightly as she studied her son's peaceful face. When she looked back up at Cashin, some of the anger had faded, replaced by a weary, guarded resolve. "His name is Elian," she said. "He is your son, and he deserves to know his father. I will not deny him that, whatever has happened between us. But I will not simply return to the manor and resume my place as your wife as though nothing occurred. You broke something last night, Cashin, something I am not certain can be repaired so easily." "Then tell me how to earn it back," he said. "I will not simply accept losing you and my son without trying." Before Alara could respond, a soft knock sounded at the cottage door, and Marjorie entered, her expression tense with concern as she glanced between the Duke and Duchess. "My lady," she said carefully, "I apologize for the interruption, but I have finished reviewing the results from the tests I ran yesterday, before the birth. There is something you both need to know." Alara's brow furrowed with confusion. "What tests?" Marjorie hesitated, glancing briefly at Cashin before continuing. "The illness you have suffered these past months, my lady. I have suspected for some time that it was not a natural ailment. The symptoms did not align with any condition I recognized, not fully. I took the liberty of testing a sample of the herbal tea you have been drinking regularly, the one prepared by the manor's kitchen staff at Lady Priscilla's recommendation." A cold silence fell over the room. Cashin's expression shifted from confusion to dawning horror as he began to understand the implications of what Marjorie was suggesting. "What did you find?" Alara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marjorie met her gaze steadily. "Traces of a substance known to cause chronic weakness, fatigue, and other symptoms consistent with illness, particularly when consumed regularly over an extended period. My lady, I believe someone has been slowly poisoning you." The words landed like a physical blow, and Alara felt the room spin slightly around her, the pieces of the past several months rearranging themselves into a far more sinister picture than she had ever imagined. The mysterious illness that had plagued her since shortly after Lady Priscilla's arrival at court. The special tea Priscilla had so thoughtfully recommended for her health. The gradual weakening that had made her seem increasingly unfit as a wife and future mother in the eyes of the entire household. Cashin's face had gone pale with shock and rising fury. "Priscilla," he said, the name coming out as barely more than a growl. Alara looked up at him sharply. "You cannot know that for certain." "The tea," Cashin said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "She insisted on it constantly. She was always so attentive to your health, always suggesting new remedies, new treatments. I thought it was kindness. I thought she cared." Marjorie cleared her throat gently. "I cannot say with certainty who is responsible, Your Grace, but the evidence clearly points toward deliberate poisoning. I would recommend a full investigation before any conclusions are drawn." Alara's hands tightened protectively around her sleeping son, a fierce, protective anger rising within her that overshadowed even her lingering resentment toward Cashin. If someone had deliberately poisoned her, had orchestrated her illness to weaken her standing in this family, to push Cashin toward setting her aside entirely, then the danger extended far beyond her own suffering. It threatened her son's safety as well. "I want the truth," she said, her voice hardening with determination. "Whoever did this will answer for it, but I want proof, undeniable proof, before any accusations are made public. I will not allow my son's birth to become the center of another scandal built on rumor and suspicion." Cashin nodded firmly, some of his earlier despair hardening into purposeful resolve. "I will launch a full investigation immediately. Whoever is responsible for this will face justice, I promise you that." Alara studied him carefully, searching for any trace of the man she had once trusted completely, the man who had promised to protect her on their wedding day. She was not yet ready to fully believe in his sincerity, not after everything that had happened, but she recognized the genuine anger and determination in his eyes. "Then let us find the truth," she said finally, "before anyone else in this family is harmed by the lies that have already caused so much damage." Outside the cottage, the morning sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the estate grounds as the household slowly began to grasp the full scope of the truth that had unfolded overnight. But inside the small cottage, 3 people, and 1 sleeping infant, faced the beginning of a far more dangerous investigation, one that would soon reveal betrayals far deeper and more calculated than anyone had yet imagined. 3 days passed before Alara agreed to return to the manor, and even then, she insisted on her own terms. She would not stay in the eastern wing, the chambers she had once shared with Cashin, filled with memories of a marriage that had grown cold and distant long before its cruel public end. Instead, she requested a separate suite in the northern tower, a quiet space with its own private entrance, where she and Elian could recover away from the prying eyes and whispered gossip that still followed her through every hallway. Cashin agreed to every condition without argument, a fact that surprised the household staff nearly as much as the sudden reversal of the Duke's public decision. Word of Elian's birth had spread quickly through the estate and beyond, and the story of the Duke who had cast aside his wife only to discover, mere hours later, that she had given him the very heir he demanded, had already become the talk of every gathering within a day's ride of Ashford Manor. The public humiliation Cashin now faced was, in its own way, a fitting consequence for the cruelty of his announcement. Nobles who had once nodded approvingly at his decision now whispered behind their hands about his hasty judgment, his failure to properly investigate his wife's condition before condemning her before the entire court. Lady Priscilla, once poised to become the next Duchess, now found herself the subject of far darker speculation, as rumors of Marjorie's poison findings began to spread through the servants' quarters and inevitably beyond the manor's walls. Alara paid little attention to any of it. Her focus remained entirely on Elian's health and her own slow recovery, both physical and emotional. She spent her days in the quiet northern tower, nursing her son, resting when she could, and turning away Cashin's frequent, careful attempts to see her. He did not push too hard, understanding on some level that her guarded distance was a wound he had inflicted himself, one that would take far longer than a few days to heal. Instead, he sent small gestures, fresh flowers from the garden, notes inquiring after her health and Elian's, and one afternoon, a beautifully carved wooden cradle, clearly crafted with great care and attention. Alara studied the cradle for a long time after it arrived, running her fingers along the smooth, polished wood, the small carved details of birds and leaves along its edges. She recognized the effort behind the gift, the genuine desire to make amends in whatever small way he could. But gifts alone could not undo the humiliation she had suffered, nor the months of unexplained illness that had nearly convinced her she was truly failing as a wife and future mother. "He tries so hard," Nettie observed one afternoon, watching Alara study the cradle from across the room. "Every day something new, flowers, notes, now this." "Trying is not the same as understanding," Alara said quietly, though her voice lacked its earlier sharpness. "He still does not fully grasp what he did, Nettie, not truly." "Perhaps not yet," Nettie said gently. "But he is beginning to, my lady. I have seen him in the garden some evenings, simply sitting alone, staring toward this tower. He looks like a man carrying a great weight." Alara said nothing, returning her attention to Elian, who had begun to stir in his cradle, his small fists waving as he worked himself toward a hungry cry. She lifted him gently, settling into the chair by the window, and for a while she allowed herself to simply focus on her son, pushing aside the complicated tangle of emotions surrounding his father. Later that same evening, a formal request arrived, delivered by Rosalind herself rather than one of the household servants. Cashin wished to speak with Alara about the ongoing investigation into her illness, an update on the findings that had been gathered so far. Alara agreed to the meeting, curious despite herself about what the investigation had uncovered. They met in a small private study, away from the more formal chambers where their disastrous public separation had occurred. Cashin rose the moment she entered, his expression tense with a mixture of hope and lingering guilt. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said. Alara took a seat across from his desk without responding, her posture careful and guarded. "You said you had news about the investigation." Cashin nodded, sitting back down slowly. Marjorie's findings were conclusive. The tea you had been drinking regularly contained trace amounts of a substance imported from the eastern provinces, one known to cause the exact symptoms you experienced: chronic fatigue, weakness, occasional dizziness and fainting spells. "For how long?" Elara asked, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Based on the severity of your symptoms and Marjorie's assessment, likely for the better part of a year," Cashin said grimly. "Perhaps longer." Elara's hands tightened in her lap. A year. Nearly the entire length of time since Lady Priscilla had first arrived at court, ingratiating herself into the household with careful attentiveness and thoughtful gestures that Elara had once mistaken for genuine friendship. "You believe it was her," Elara said, "Priscilla." "The tea was her recommendation," Cashin said. "She insisted on bringing it herself on several occasions, claiming it was a special blend from her family's estate, known for its health benefits. The kitchen staff confirmed she often prepared it personally rather than allowing the regular staff to handle it." "That is not proof," Elara said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It is suspicion." "I know," Cashin said, "which is why I have not yet made any public accusation. I do not wish to repeat the mistake I made with you, condemning someone without sufficient evidence, without giving them the chance to answer for themselves. But Elara, the pieces fit too neatly to ignore. Someone deliberately weakened you, made you appear unfit for this family over the course of nearly a year, and it worked precisely as intended, right up until the moment you gave birth to our son." Elara sat in silence for a long moment, processing the full weight of what he was suggesting. If Cashin was right, if Priscilla had truly orchestrated her slow poisoning over the better part of a year, then everything Elara had suffered, every symptom, every fear that she was failing her family, every moment of doubt about her own body's ability to carry a child safely, had been a calculated cruelty designed to clear a path toward the Ashford title. "I want her found guilty through proper evidence," Elara said finally, her voice hardening with determination. "Not through suspicion or rumor, but through undeniable proof that cannot be dismissed or explained away. If she did this, Cashin, she needs to answer for it fully publicly in front of the same court that watched you humiliate me. I will not allow her to escape consequence while quietly slipping away to scheme against some other unsuspecting family." Cashin nodded firmly. "I agree completely. I have already begun quietly gathering additional evidence. Servants who witnessed her handling the tea directly, records of purchases from merchants who deal in rare imported goods. It will take time to build an airtight case, but I intend to see this through properly." "And in the meantime," Elara asked, "what happens with her? She remains here at the manor, free to continue whatever scheme she has planned next." "I have distanced myself from her considerably since Elian's birth," Cashin said. "She remains as a guest for now, under the guise of ongoing courtship discussions that I have not yet formally ended, purely to avoid alerting her to our suspicions before we have gathered sufficient proof. But believe me, Elara, the moment we have what we need, she will face full accountability for what she has done." Elara studied him carefully, noting the genuine determination in his expression, a stark contrast to the cold, dismissive man who had stood before the entire court just days before. Perhaps, she thought, the shock of nearly losing everything, his wife, his son, his family's future, had begun to shift something within him after all. "There is something else," Elara said slowly, "that I need you to understand, Cashin, regardless of how this investigation concludes." "What is that?" "Even if Priscilla is proven guilty of everything you suspect, it does not erase what you did," Elara said. "You made your decision to cast me aside based on your own judgment, your own impatience, your own willingness to believe the worst of me without ever asking for my side of things. Priscilla's poison may have created the circumstances, but you are the one who chose to act on them so cruelly, so publicly, without a single moment of genuine inquiry into what I was actually suffering." Cashin's expression fell, the weight of her words settling heavily across his features. "You are right," he said quietly. "I cannot blame her entirely for my own failures as a husband. I should have asked. I should have investigated properly before making such a devastating decision. That failure is mine alone, regardless of what she may have done to manipulate the circumstances. Then know this, Elara said, rising from her chair. I will allow you to be part of Elian's life. He deserves his father, and I will not deny him that connection. But rebuilding trust between us, if that is even something either of us truly wants, will take far longer than a simple apology or a carved cradle. It will require you proving, through consistent action over time, that you have truly changed, not simply reacting to circumstance, but genuinely understanding the harm you caused. Cashin nodded slowly, accepting her terms without argument. I understand, and I am prepared to prove that, however long it takes. Elara studied him for a moment longer before turning to leave the study, her mind already returning to Elian, waiting for her in the northern tower. Behind her, Cashin remained seated at his desk, staring at the closed door long after she had gone, the weight of everything still ahead of him settling heavily across his shoulders. The investigation into Lady Priscilla's deception was only beginning, and neither of them yet understood the full depth of the scheme that had nearly destroyed their family entirely. The investigation moved carefully over the following 2 weeks, conducted with a discretion that surprised even Rosalind, who had expected her son to act with the same rash impatience that had led to the disastrous public announcement. Cashin assigned the task of gathering evidence to a trusted steward named Aldrich, a quiet, methodical man who had served the Ashford family for over a decade, and who possessed a talent for discovering details others might overlook. Aldrich began by speaking privately with the kitchen staff, careful not to raise suspicion among the wider household, gathering accounts of exactly how often Lady Priscilla had visited the kitchens to prepare her special tea blend herself. The picture that emerged was damning. According to 3 separate members of the kitchen staff, Priscilla had insisted on personally overseeing the preparation of Elara's tea on no fewer than 24 occasions over the past several months, always under the pretense of ensuring the delicate blend was mixed correctly. She had brought the dried herbs herself, in a small wooden box she kept locked, never allowing the kitchen staff to examine its contents directly. Aldrich also uncovered records from a merchant in the nearby town who dealt in rare imported goods, confirming that Lady Priscilla had made several private purchases over the past year, always paid for in cash and always requested with strict discretion. The merchant, once assured his cooperation would remain confidential and that no blame would fall upon him for the sale of legally traded goods, provided a detailed account of the substances Priscilla had purchased, several of which matched precisely with the poison Marjorie had identified in her tests. While Aldrich gathered this evidence quietly, Elara continued her slow recovery in the northern tower, splitting her days between caring for Elian and cautiously rebuilding a tentative, careful relationship with Cashin. He visited daily now, always respectful of her boundaries, never overstaying his welcome, content simply to spend a few quiet hours holding his son and speaking softly with Elara about the investigation's progress. She found herself, despite everything, slowly softening toward him, though she remained careful not to let her guard down too completely. The wound of that public humiliation still ached whenever she thought of it too directly, but she could not deny the genuine effort Cashin showed each day, nor the tender way he held Elian, his expression filled with a wonder and devotion that seemed entirely sincere. One afternoon, as Cashin sat with Elian in the northern tower, the infant's small hand wrapped instinctively around his father's finger, Elara found herself watching the scene with a complicated mixture of lingering hurt and reluctant warmth. "He has your eyes," Cashin said softly, studying his son's face with quiet amazement. "I did not expect that. I thought perhaps he would look entirely like an Ashford." "He has quite a bit of both of us, I think," Elara said, settling into the chair across from him. "Nettie says his temperament reminds her of you actually, stubborn even at only 2 weeks old." Cashin laughed softly, a genuine sound that Elara had not heard from him in what felt like a very long time. "I suppose that is fitting." The moment lingered between them, comfortable in a way that surprised them both, until Cashin's expression grew more serious, the weight of the ongoing investigation returning to his thoughts. "Aldrich believes he has gathered sufficient evidence," he said, "enough to bring formal accusations against Priscilla. He wishes to present everything to us both this evening before we decide how to proceed." Alara's posture straightened slightly, old tension returning to her shoulders. "Then, it is nearly time." "Yes," Cashin said, "though I want your input on how we handle this. You mentioned wanting a public reckoning, similar to the humiliation I inflicted upon you. I understand that desire, but I also want to ensure we proceed carefully, with undeniable proof, so that Priscilla cannot simply deny everything and escape true accountability." Alara considered this for a long moment. Her initial anger, the fierce desire for public vengeance against the woman who had poisoned her for nearly a year, had settled somewhat over the past 2 weeks into something more measured, though no less determined. "I want the truth exposed fully," she said. "Not simply for my own sense of justice, though I will admit that matters to me, but because a woman capable of poisoning someone slowly over the course of a year, purely to advance her own position, is dangerous. If she escapes consequence here, she will simply move on to manipulate some other unsuspecting family, perhaps with even more devastating results." Cashin nodded gravely. "Then let us hear what Aldrich has uncovered and decide together how best to proceed." That evening, Aldrich presented his findings in the same private study where Cashin and Alara had spoken weeks before. He laid out the evidence methodically: the kitchen staff's testimonies, the merchant's records of Priscilla's private purchases, and finally, a small wooden box that Aldrich had managed to recover from Priscilla's chambers earlier that day, under the pretense of routine household maintenance. "This box matches the description given by the kitchen staff," Aldrich explained, carefully opening the lid to reveal a small quantity of dried herbs still remaining inside. "I took the liberty of having Marjorie examine a sample this afternoon." He produced a folded letter, Marjorie's formal written assessment confirming that the herbs matched precisely the substance found in Alara's system months earlier. Alara stared at the small box, a chill running through her at the sight of the very poison that had slowly weakened her for nearly a year, sitting innocuously in a carved wooden container that Priscilla had likely kept hidden among her personal belongings the entire time. "This is more than sufficient," Cashin said grimly, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. "Combined with the merchant's records and the kitchen staff's testimonies, there is no reasonable explanation Priscilla could offer to escape these accusations." "How do we proceed?" Alara asked. Cashin considered the question carefully. "I believe we should confront her directly first, privately, giving her the opportunity to explain herself before any public accusation is made. Not out of mercy, but to ensure we have exhausted every possibility, so that, when we do bring this before the court, there can be no claim that we acted rashly or without proper process." Alara appreciated the careful, measured approach, so different from the impulsive cruelty of his earlier decision regarding their marriage. Perhaps, she thought, he had genuinely learned something from the consequences of that hasty judgment. "Very well," she said. "Let us confront her together tomorrow morning." The following day, Priscilla was summoned to the same private study under the pretense of discussing the household's upcoming social calendar. She arrived dressed elegantly as always, her golden hair perfectly arranged, her expression carrying the easy confidence of a woman who still believed her position within the household remained secure. Her confidence faltered the moment she stepped into the room and saw Alara seated beside Cashin, along with Aldrich standing near the desk, the small wooden box placed prominently in front of him. "What is this?" Priscilla asked, her voice carrying a slight edge of unease beneath its polished composure. "Please sit," Cashin said, his tone carefully neutral. "We have some matters to discuss." Priscilla hesitated before taking the offered seat, her eyes flicking nervously toward the wooden box on the desk. "Of course, Your Grace, whatever you need." "We have discovered the cause of Alara's prolonged illness these past months," Cashin said, watching Priscilla's reaction carefully. It seems she was being deliberately poisoned through a specially prepared tea blend that was insisted upon and personally overseen by someone within this household. Priscilla's face paled slightly, though she maintained her composure with visible effort. "That is a serious accusation, Your Grace. Surely you do not believe I had anything to do with such a thing." "The tea in question matches herbs found in this box," Aldrich said calmly, "recovered from your personal chambers this morning. Marjorie has confirmed the substance matches precisely what was found in Lady Alara's system." "This is absurd," Priscilla said, though her voice had begun to waver slightly. "Anyone could have placed such a thing in my chambers. This proves nothing beyond someone's clear attempt to frame me." "The kitchen staff have testified that you personally oversaw the preparation of this tea on numerous occasions," Cashin said. "And a merchant in town has confirmed selling you the very substance found in that box, on multiple occasions over the past year, always paid discreetly in cash." Priscilla's composure finally cracked, her carefully maintained expression flickering with something closer to panic. "I can explain," she said quickly. "It was not meant to cause serious harm, only enough to weaken her slightly, to help you see clearly, Cashin, that she was not strong enough to bear the burdens of this family. I did it for your sake, for the sake of the Ashford legacy." The room fell into stunned silence at her sudden, unguarded confession, the truth finally spilling forth after months of careful deception. Though even now, Priscilla seemed unable to fully grasp the severity of what she had done. "For my sake," Cashin repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "You poisoned my wife for nearly a year, weakened her health, nearly cost her the safe delivery of our son, and you claim it was for my sake." Priscilla's eyes widened as she realized the depth of her own admission, the panic in her expression growing more visible with each passing second. "Cashin, please, you must understand. I only wanted what was best for this family. She was always so weak, so fragile. I truly believed she was unfit to carry the burdens of the Ashford name. I never intended for anyone to be seriously harmed." "You nearly killed her," Alara said, her voice trembling with barely controlled fury as she finally spoke for the first time since Priscilla's arrival. "Do you understand that? For nearly a year, I believed my own body was failing me, that I was simply too weak to fulfill my duties as a wife and mother. I endured whispered judgment from an entire household, humiliation in front of the court, the eventual destruction of my marriage, all because you decided I was not worthy of the position you desired for yourself." "I did not force him to cast you aside," Priscilla said, some of her earlier composure returning as she attempted to shift blame. "That decision was his own. I merely created circumstances that revealed the truth of your unsuitability." "There was no truth to reveal," Cashin said sharply. "There was only a lie you constructed through deliberate poisoning, a lie I was foolish enough to believe without proper investigation. You manipulated an entire household, endangered my wife's life, and nearly cost my son the chance to be born safely into this world, all for your own ambition." Priscilla's mask of confidence finally shattered entirely, tears welling in her eyes as the full weight of her exposed scheme settled over her. "What will happen to me now?" Cashin studied her for a long moment, his expression cold and unforgiving. "You will face formal charges before the regional court. Poisoning, particularly against a member of a noble household, carries severe consequences under the law. I intend to see that justice is properly served." "Cashin, please," Priscilla begged, her earlier arrogance crumbling entirely into desperate pleading. "My family's reputation, my father's standing at court, all of it will be destroyed. Surely there is some other way to resolve this quietly, without such a public scandal. You should have considered the consequences before you began slowly poisoning an innocent woman," Alara said, her voice hard and unyielding. "You spent nearly a year methodically destroying my health, my reputation, and very nearly my marriage, all while presenting yourself as a caring, attentive friend. Do not now expect mercy simply because the truth has finally caught up with your ambitions." Aldrich moved toward the door, signaling for the two guards waiting outside to enter the study. Priscilla's protests grew louder as the reality of her situation fully settled over her. But Cashin remained resolute, watching with grim satisfaction as the guards escorted her from the room to be held under formal confinement, while the necessary legal proceedings were arranged. Once the door closed behind them, a heavy silence fell over the study. Ilara sat quietly for a long moment, processing the full resolution of a truth that had haunted her for nearly a year, the source of her mysterious illness finally exposed and confirmed beyond any doubt. "It is over," she said finally, though her voice carried more exhaustion than relief. "The immediate danger, yes," Cashin said, moving to sit beside her rather than across the desk, a small gesture of closeness that Ilara did not immediately reject. "But the formal proceedings will take some time. There will need to be a public hearing, given the severity of the charges and Priscilla's noble standing. I imagine word of this will spread quickly through the court, given how thoroughly the story of your rejection and Elian's birth has already traveled." Ilara considered this, a flicker of old anxiety rising at the thought of yet another public spectacle involving her private struggles. "I do not wish to be paraded before the court again, Cashin. I have endured enough public humiliation this past month to last a lifetime." "You will not need to attend the formal hearing unless you wish to," Cashin assured her. "Aldrich's evidence, combined with Marjorie's testimony and the merchant's records, should be more than sufficient without requiring your direct presence. I intend to handle the public aspects of this matter myself, as a means of correcting the harm my own hasty judgment caused in the first place." Ilara studied him carefully, noting the genuine determination in his expression, a stark contrast to the uncertain, easily swayed man who had stood before the court weeks earlier, willing to believe the worst of her without proper investigation. "You have changed," she said quietly, almost to herself. "These past weeks, you have handled everything with far more care and consideration than I expected." "I nearly lost everything that truly mattered," Cashin said, his voice softening. "My wife, my son, all because I allowed pride and pressure to override proper judgment. I do not intend to make that same mistake again, Ilara. Whatever trust I have left to rebuild with you, I intend to earn it properly this time, through consistent action rather than empty promises." Ilara said nothing for a long moment, the weight of his words settling somewhere between her lingering hurt and a cautious, reluctant hope she had not expected to feel again so soon. She was not yet ready to fully trust him, not after the depth of the wound he had inflicted, but she could no longer deny the genuine effort and growth she had witnessed over these past difficult weeks. News of Priscilla's exposure spread through Ashford Manor within hours, and by the following morning, word had reached the wider court, traveling swiftly through the same gossip networks that had once spread cruel whispers about Ilara's supposed inability to bear children. Now the narrative shifted dramatically, painting Ilara as a wronged woman who had endured incredible hardship with quiet strength and dignity, while Priscilla's scheming ambition became the subject of scandalized condemnation throughout noble circles. The Dowager Duchess, once eager to see Ilara set aside, now found herself publicly defending her daughter-in-law's character at every social gathering she attended, quick to correct anyone who dared repeat the old rumors that had once circulated so freely. Her transformation surprised many who remembered her earlier impatience for an heir, but Ilara understood the shift was born from genuine guilt over her own role in pushing Cashin toward his hasty decision. Over the following weeks, as the formal proceedings against Priscilla moved forward through the regional court, Ilara found herself slowly settling into a new rhythm at Ashford Manor. She remained in the northern tower with Elian, though Cashin's visits grew longer and more frequent, filled with quiet conversations that gradually rebuilt small pieces of the trust that had once existed between them. She did not rush the process, unwilling to simply forgive and forget the depth of humiliation she had endured, but she found herself, day by day, allowing small moments of genuine connection to return between them. Watching him with Elian, patient and devoted despite the demands of managing the ongoing legal proceedings and the estate's daily affairs, reminded her of the man she had once fallen in love with, before pressure and pride had temporarily obscured his better nature. Priscilla's formal hearing took place nearly a month after her initial confession, the evidence presented by Aldrich proving overwhelming and undeniable before the regional magistrate. She was found guilty of deliberate poisoning against a member of a noble household, a crime that carried severe consequences under regional law, resulting in her permanent exile from court and the forfeiture of her family's standing among the nobility. Her father, humiliated and furious at his daughter's actions, offered no defense on her behalf, distancing the family name from the scandal as swiftly as possible to salvage what remained of their reputation. Alara felt a complicated mixture of relief and lingering sorrow as news of the verdict reached her. Justice had been served, the truth fully exposed and properly punished, yet the damage inflicted upon her own life, the year of suffering, the public humiliation, the fractured trust in her marriage, could not be simply undone by a single court ruling. Still, as she held Elian close that evening, watching him grow stronger and more alert with each passing day, she allowed herself to feel a cautious sense of closure. The truth had finally prevailed. Now, only the question of what future she wished to build for herself and for her son remained to be answered. Spring arrived at Ashford Manor with a gentle warmth that seemed to soften even the coldest memories of the winter that had preceded it. Elian had grown into a lively, curious infant, his small laughter now a common sound echoing through the halls of the northern tower, where Alara had chosen to remain even as the formal chaos of Priscilla's trial and its aftermath finally settled into quiet resolution. Cashin visited every single day without fail, and over the passing months, those visits had grown from careful, guarded conversations into something warmer, something that occasionally reminded Alara of the early days of their courtship, before duty and pressure had complicated everything between them. Still, she had not yet agreed to formally reconcile their marriage, and Cashin, true to his word, had never pushed her toward a decision before she was ready. Instead, he had spent these months proving himself through steady, consistent action, managing the estate's affairs with renewed diligence, publicly defending Alara's character whenever old whispers threatened to resurface, and dedicating countless hours to simply being present for his son, learning the small details of fatherhood with a devotion that surprised even his own mother. Rosalind, too, had changed considerably since the events of that fateful night. She visited the northern tower regularly now, no longer the cold, impatient woman who had once pressured her son toward such a devastating decision, but a doting grandmother eager to spend time with Elian, and increasingly, a genuine source of support for Alara herself. "You have handled all of this with more grace than I ever could have," Rosalind said one afternoon, watching Alara gently rock Elian to sleep in the soft light of the tower's western window. "I do not think I could have forgiven so readily, given everything you endured." "I have not fully forgiven," Alara admitted quietly. "Not entirely, but I have chosen not to let bitterness define the rest of my life or my son's future. That is different from forgiveness, I think. It is simply a choice to move forward carefully on my own terms." Rosalind nodded, understanding the distinction better than most. "And Cashin, where do things stand between you two, if you do not mind my asking?" Alara considered the question for a long moment, glancing down at Elian's peaceful, sleeping face. "He has shown me, consistently, over these past months, that he understands the depth of his mistake. He has not simply expected forgiveness to be given freely, nor has he grown impatient with my caution. That matters more to me than any grand gesture or apology ever could." "So there is hope then," Rosalind said, a small, hopeful smile crossing her features. "There is possibility," Alara corrected gently. "Whether that becomes something more permanent remains to be seen." That evening, after Rosalind had departed and Elian had settled into a peaceful sleep in his carved wooden cradle, Cashin arrived for his usual evening visit, finding Alara seated by the window, watching the last light of sunset fade across the estate grounds. "You seem thoughtful this evening," he observed, settling into the chair across from her. "Your mother and I spoke earlier," Alara said, "about forgiveness, about what it means to move forward after everything that happened." Cashin's expression grew more serious, sensing the weight behind her words. "And what conclusions did you reach?" Alara turned to face him fully, studying his features carefully in the fading evening light. Over these past months, she had watched him transform from the proud, impatient man who had so carelessly discarded her, into someone more thoughtful, more genuinely attentive to the needs of those around him. The change had not happened overnight, nor had it come easily, but she could no longer deny its authenticity. "I have decided," she said slowly, "that I am ready to consider what a future together might look like. Not immediately, not without continued care and patience on both our parts, but I no longer wish to keep you at such careful distance." Cashin's expression shifted through surprise, relief, and finally, a cautious hope that mirrored her own careful optimism. "Alara, I do not take that decision lightly. I know I have much still to prove, and I intend to continue earning your trust for however long it takes, without ever taking your forgiveness for granted." "I know," Alara said softly. "That is precisely why I am willing to consider it. Because you have shown me, through your actions rather than empty words, that you understand what true partnership requires." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the last colors of sunset fade into the soft darkness of evening, the quiet sounds of Elian's peaceful breathing drifting from his cradle nearby. It was not a dramatic reconciliation, not the sweeping romantic gesture that might have satisfied the gossiping nobles who had followed their story so closely over these past months. It was something quieter, more genuine, built carefully from consistent effort and hard-earned trust rather than grand declarations. Over the following weeks, Alara gradually allowed Cashin back into her daily life, though she maintained her own space in the northern tower for some time longer, unwilling to rush the process of rebuilding what had been so thoroughly broken. They spent evenings together, discussing the estate's affairs, sharing stories from their respective days, and slowly rediscovering the genuine friendship that had once formed the foundation of their marriage before duty and pressure had complicated everything between them. Word of their gradual reconciliation spread through the court just as quickly as the original scandal had, though this time, the story carried a different tone entirely, one of redemption and hard-earned wisdom rather than cruelty and hasty judgment. Nobles who had once gossiped eagerly about Alara's supposed failures now spoke admiringly of her quiet strength, her refusal to simply accept easy forgiveness, and her insistence on genuine change before allowing trust to be rebuilt. 6 months after Elian's birth, on a warm summer evening filled with the soft golden light of the setting sun, Cashin formally requested a private audience with Alara in the same great hall where he had once so publicly cast her aside. This time, no crowd of nobles gathered to witness the moment, no whispered judgments filled the air. Only the two of them, standing quietly beneath the same tall windows where their marriage had once ended so cruelly. "I wanted to make this right," Cashin said, "in the same place where I first broke your trust. Not with grand ceremony or public spectacle, but simply, honestly between the two of us." Alara studied him carefully, recognizing the significance of the gesture, the deliberate choice to return to this specific place, to acknowledge directly the harm that had been done here, rather than simply moving forward as though it had never happened. "I formally ask for your forgiveness," Cashin continued, "not because I believe I deserve it easily, but because I hope that through my actions these past months, I have shown you that I understand fully what I nearly lost, and what I am committed to protecting for the rest of our lives together." Alara felt tears gathering in her eyes, though these were tears of quiet healing rather than the pain she had once carried through this very hall. "I forgive you, Cashin," she said softly, "not because the pain has entirely disappeared, but because I believe, truly believe, that you have become someone worthy of that forgiveness." Cashin reached for her hand gently, and this time, Alara did not pull away. They stood together in the quiet hall, bathed in the soft golden light of sunset, the painful memories of that terrible night finally beginning to fade into something more distant, replaced by the promise of a future rebuilt on genuine understanding and hard-earned trust. In the months and years that followed, Ashford Manor became known throughout the region not for the scandal of its duke's hasty rejection, nor even for the dramatic poisoning scheme that had nearly destroyed its ducal family entirely, but for the quiet strength and resilience of its duchess, who had faced unimaginable betrayal and emerged not simply as a victim, but as a woman who commanded genuine respect on her own terms. Elian grew strong and healthy, surrounded by parents who had learned, through great difficulty, the true meaning of partnership and trust. And Alara, once cast aside so cruelly for her supposed failures, became remembered instead as the duchess who had refused to accept easy answers, who had demanded genuine change before offering her forgiveness, and who had ultimately built a stronger, more honest marriage from the wreckage of a single, terrible night. The story of the duke who cast aside his sickly wife, only to learn the very next day that she had given him the heir he so desperately wanted, became a lesson whispered throughout noble households for generations, a reminder that hasty judgment and pride could nearly destroy what mattered most, and that true strength was found not in power or position, but in the quiet resilience to demand better, and the wisdom to recognize genuine change when it finally arrived.